I'd been doing my study for this morning's passage. And after my study, I had written up a summary of the passage that I send out to our worship leaders so that they can start helping plan service together. Then, just the night before the events in Turkey, I had finished putting together the daily worship guide for this week. It was fresh on my mind, and it was amazing to watch the coverage live, because you could feel the tangible confusion in Turkey as it was all playing out. Imagine, just for a second, what was happening. Soldiers had begun to march through the streets. Tanks rolled through major cities. Military planes were flying overhead, and they began to block bridges. They began to close airports. Using national television, government officials announced that there was a military coup underway. But they made clear that there was no way in which this coup, this attempt at overthrowing the government, would succeed. And then right after that, Turkish television was shut down. And what do you think if you're a Turkish citizen? This experience is so far outside of anything we have ever experienced. As we look at transitions of power every 4 years that are historically fairly uneventful. What do you do if you live in Turkey? Because a coup is basically intended to be swift and decisive. And here you are, you've seen the military move through, seize key locations. On top of that, nobody has heard from the president. And there are rumors that he's been out of the country. Then within the hour, you receive what sounds like an official statement. Turkish armed forces have completely taken over the administration of the country. Maybe you're struggling to imagine what this would be like. The confusion it might create. The sense of utter ambiguity and loss. But the Turkish people would know exactly what was happening. And they would actually have real reasons to believe this coup would be successful. As I was following the events in real time, I was also trying to read up on Turkey because I realized I don't know that much about Turkey. And one of the things I discovered was that Turkey has a history of military coups. Since 1960, the military has overthrown 4 different Turkish governments. And it looked like number 5 was about to be in the books. But then through a series of events over several hours, new evidence began to suggest that the winds had changed and that the coup was maybe not as decisive as signs originally suggested. Turkey's president, whose location had been unknown, was able to deliver an address via Skype. Social media is incredible, right? In his address, he suggested that the coup was actually the work of just a small group within the armed forces, hardly the entire Turkish armed forces, as that original statement had suggested. The president then called on Turkish citizens to go out and to protest in the streets. He wanted it to be seen that the coup did not have wide popular support. Public opinion began to change as quickly as people were flooding the streets. And finally, late in the evening, the president was able to return, not only to the country, but to the capital. And it was at that point that the live news began to shift its tone. The coup was failing. It would not succeed. Probably. You never know with these things. They can be a bit uncertain. But most likely. I hope you can hear in the details the parallels with the passage that we just heard. In verse 1, Sheba blows the military trumpet, calling on the people to take action and to join him. In verse 2, we then read the initial news report of the coup's beginning. So all the men of Israel withdrew from David and followed Sheba. But then we get some hints that the coup doesn't quite include all of Israel. It's maybe not as big and as widespread as we originally thought. Verse 2 continues, the men of Judah followed their king steadfastly from Jordan to Jerusalem. Israel's southerners stick with David, traveling with him back to his capital. There, news spreads that the king has solidified his position. In verse 3 we read, David came to his house at Jerusalem. If you are a people with a king, there is no more secure image than your king sitting securely in his home. The next report is a bit surprising, because we're given signs that there is some infighting within David's camp, within its inner circle. If David is going to shut down this rebellion, he is going to need clear control of his military. National crises can test political relationships and loyalties. And this all gets sorted out so that Joab, David's longtime general, steps out, sort of emerges as the clear leader of David's forces. When people see that Joab is in charge, they can trust that David is in control of his kingdom, and Joab is then able to lead David's loyal army out to end the uprising. So that by verse 13, we read that all the people went on after Joab to pursue Sheba. Meanwhile, in verse 14, Sheba passed through all the tribes of Israel, and all of the Bichrites assembled and followed him. Remember the story. It's short and sweet. It speeds up, and here the conflict comes to a head. David has solidified his command. He's organized his forces, and they're racing out after Sheba and his rebel army. But before we see how this plays out, I want you to watch something in our passage with me. So if you go back to verse 1, I want you to notice how Sheba is identified. We read that Sheba is called the son of Bichri. Look at verse 2. Sheba is again called the son of Bichri. Verse 6, again, Sheba, the son of Bichri. Verse 7, the same. Verse 10, the same. And again, in verse 13. Verse 14. Verse 14, then, is the first and only time Sheba is not identified as the son of Bichri. 6 times our ears have been primed to recognize Sheba's origins. Sheba is the son of Bichri. So that this 7th time we notice Sheba has traveled through all of the tribes of Israel, assembling the Bichrites around him. And only the Bichrites. Who is challenging David and God's kingdom? Sheba and what army? Sheba and his family. There's this classic movie scene where the main character decides he's going to make a big scene and walk out of his job. And he gives this epic speech to his entire company, and he wraps it up by saying, "Who's coming with me?" And literally one girl joins him, and they walk out together with a fish. And I kind of think of this scene every time I read verse 14. Sheba and the Bichrites have gathered together to oppose David and the kingdom of Israel. It's kind of embarrassing. It was started with such promise. Sheba and all Israel has unraveled so that now it is just Sheba and his Bichrite family. I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you thought there were a lot more people who felt the same way as you, only to discover you were kind of alone in that. Or you thought that it was you and a lot of people, you were together, only to find that no, they had abandoned you. But we're reminded of the report of that the Turkish armed forces had seized control of the government, only to then learn out that it was really only this small fraction of the armed forces that were involved in the attempted coup. The small faction within Turkey's armed forces had hoped to move quickly enough to generate enough momentum so that the entire army would join. It just didn't happen. In both Turkey and our passage, the coup then was ultimately foiled by citizens who didn't think the coup would be successful, people who didn't get on board, people who actively undermined the efforts of the rebels. And just like that, both attempts at overthrowing the government were over, really as quickly as they started. Short embarrassing, and yet, strangely, really significant. The fact that this quick, pitiful, unsuccessful attempt is recorded in Scripture after 5 chapters of a huge, almost successful attempt at overthrowing the government should cause us to wonder, what is God up to? What does God want us to know? What does God want us to be prepared for? This morning's passage invites us to think about the church, people of God. It invites us to think about the church, to think about our relationship with the church, and to consider our role in maintaining the unity of God's church. Of course, when we talk about church, we're talking about 2 different things at the same time, which can be confusing. And so you have to sort of work to keep that straight. But church refers to both the one big worldwide universal church spanning the last 2,000 years, while church also refers to this church, this local congregation, and every little congregation. This passage challenges us to consider whether there are people like Sheba within the church global and the church local. Are there Shebas within the church who would incite rebellion to either overthrow the church's leadership or altogether divide the church? Are we tempted to be Shebas within the church? This passage's critical idea is that we're talking about insurrection. Sheba is an insider. Sheba is one of us. Now, I don't say that to make us all paranoid, so looking around like, are you Sheba? Who's Sheba among us? It doesn't quite work like that, but as a reminder that the Scriptures constantly teach us that there are always enemies who will attack the church from the outside. But the most dangerous enemies are those who would divide from within. That's not to say that the church always has enemies within. Not every local congregation has a Sheba. Now, some of them seem to get lots of Shebas. That's unfortunate. But the reality is, Shebas don't start out as rebels. Shebas are made. They're given power. They become usurpers. And so just as important as to finding any Shebas that might be stirring discontentment and resentment within a congregation, within the church, we have to honestly assess whether we might be making Shebas. And I want to suggest that our passage this morning leads us to consider 3 different ways the church makes Shebas. Or at least 3 ways the church creates conditions that make it possible for Shebas to get something going. And so I'll tell you the 3, and then we'll sort of dig into each of them. We'll give each a little bit of time. The first is that we establish a precedent of insurrection. We establish a precedent. The second is that the leaders of God's people, the leaders of the church, are divided, quarreling, or otherwise unready to respond when Sheba begins to call on followers to act. And the third is that we would allow an attitude of fear and self-centeredness to take over, to be a dominant attitude in the community. So we'll take a look at each of these 3, starting with the idea that a community can establish a precedent of insurrection. What do I mean by that? This actually highlights another similarity between our passage and the attempted coup in Turkey. Both are built on precedent. Every single military coup in Turkey has had the same purpose: to preserve the secular democracy founded by Ataturk in 1923. So that when the military becomes concerned that Turkey's government is becoming too religious or too authoritarian, at every point it has intervened and it has overthrown the government in order to restore it. Doing this 4 times since 1960 suggests this is not just an accepted practice, it is an expected practice. From what I've read, the people responsible for the coup were pretty shocked that they didn't gain wider support for their attempt. Because they were simply doing what the military does when the military sees a problem with the government. The same is true for Sheba. He doesn't just wake up one day and go, you know what, I think I should take on the most successful military that Israel has ever had. Sheba learns that rebellion, that revolution, is a legitimate path for fixing your social concerns. The question is, where did he learn this? It's important to remember the history of what David has been as king and what he was before king. Because before he was king, he went really far out of his way to show people that rebellion is never an option. Right? David had several chances to easily overthrow Saul, but he refused to. By David's example, he established a precedent for Israel. You do not ever threaten somebody who has been anointed king by God. Of course, this came in really handy for him being the anointed as king, but he established a precedent. And so it shouldn't surprise us that no one, or that there is never any mention of any sort of movement to rebel against David, to revolt against David, to overthrow his kingdom. Until David's own son establishes a new precedent. David had worked hard to show Israel what it looks like to trust God with the selection of your kings. Absalom showed Israel what it looks like to take matters into your own hands. Sheba's rebellion comes immediately after Absalom has made rebellion a legitimate option in the minds of the Israelites. I think this is a really important idea for us because in our minds, and maybe you can immediately see how this works, there is a huge gap between what is theoretically possible for someone else to do and what is a legitimate option for you to actually do. Every year, a group of us in Livermore, we give these presentations at local high schools on depression awareness and suicide prevention. Part of the presentation includes some stats regarding those who have had a close family member who have attempted suicide. The stats suggest that while the average person might have a thought about suicide, that thought has a different power, it has a different potency if you have a parent or a grandparent who's attempted suicide. Statistically, the likelihood that someone in such a family will make a similar attempt goes up dramatically. But we're talking statistics, which means not everyone with a family member who's attempted suicide will make an attempt themselves. In fact, many will not. Also, you may be more likely to get divorced if your parents got divorced. But that doesn't mean you will get divorced or that you must. You're just more likely to consider it a legitimate possibility, a legitimate possible option for yourself. If somebody who is in your close sphere of trust has done that as well. And the same is true here. Precedent has been established. Absalom paved the way for overthrowing the government as acceptable practice. He normalizes it. Sheba is afraid and discontent, and he sees in Absalom an example to imitate. Denominations were born out of a movement that began in division. It shouldn't surprise us that apart from one major split over 1,500 years, the church rarely experienced what the church has since experienced since the Protestant Reformation. All it took was a major division led by major figures in the church, and the precedent was set. Division became normal in the church. So that for hundreds of years, denominations have formed, and then denominations within denominations have sprouted up, so that then you have non-denominational denominations, so that today, the local independent congregation is just the newest and smallest form of a denomination. In many ways, the church is almost completely lacking good and faithful examples of Christians doing the hard yet beautiful Spirit-led work of maintaining unity in Christ's church. It's far more often we hear about somebody starting a new church because they were discontent somewhere else, or a group starting a new denomination because they're discontent somewhere else. It is rare that we hear churches joining together, denominations joining together. Division is so normal that too many people don't even know what to do except leave, split, divide, or overthrow. These are the examples that have been given to us when things aren't going our way. Which takes us to our second point, the second factor. When leaders themselves are divided and quarreling, they are not offering the church a path for peacemaking, and leaders who are fighting with each other are not ready to engage as Sheba, who rises up and is ready to rebel. Our passage introduces us to this in a kind of an amazing way. It tells us the story of how this rebellion comes to end, but we see David's dysfunctional leadership team. 2 Samuel, as we've been reading through it, has been building a case against Joab. I don't know what your small groups have done with Joab, but in our group, Joab is consistently mocked as this power-hungry guy who just wants to kill people all the time. 2 Samuel has been making that case. Joab, David's go-to field general, is basically uncontrollable, even by David. He does what he wants according to his own agenda, and he even has leverage over David, which makes it really tough for David to do anything about him. And all of this leads up to last week's passage, where Joab is now responsible for murdering one of David's sons, Absalom. So that whatever distaste, distrust David had for Joab, he never dealt with it. Joab was an effective general. David basically was content putting up with his junk. And then, when he used Joab to murder Uriah, David put himself in a bind. He couldn't risk Joab turning on him. But at this point in the story, the murder of Absalom seems to be too much for David, and David is ready to move on from Joab. And the first word at Sheba's rebellion, David is calling up a new field general, somebody we've never even heard of. But David seems to have miscalculated what you do when rebellion is underway. The men of Judah have only ever fought for David, Joab, and Joab's brother. Literally for decades, these are the only people they have followed into battle. The absolute worst time to try out new leaders is in the middle of a crisis, especially a crisis where you have no idea who's actually on your side and who you can trust. In an attempted overthrow where nobody knows who is loyal to whom, a new guy shows up and starts trying to rally the troops. There are going to be issues. And these issues mean that Amasa delays in gathering a force to come. He can't get a fighting force together. And this delay gives the appearance that David doesn't have a loyal army ready to fight for him. And so Sheba is inspired, and it gives him more time to travel, it gives him more time to recruit, it gives him more time to secure a position. My guess is that Joab's murder of David's son, Absalom, created really interesting doubt in people's minds as to whether Joab and David could ever work together again. Right? Usually, murdering somebody's child kind of means that your working relationship is not going to exist anymore. This doubt seems to inspire Sheba. If Joab's not there to fight for David, Sheba stands a chance. And at first in the story, it looks like this might be true. David turns from Joab. He can't rally an army together. But the moment that Joab is back in action, I mean, you read the story, just like that, troops fall in the line, there they are. And my guess is that the moment Sheba's, it was in that moment where Sheba discovered that Joab was back in control, that Sheba's support began to disappear, and Sheba locked himself away in a defended city. Can you see the way that division and quarreling among the leaders of God's people undermine their ability to respond to a dangerous internal threat? David, Joab, Amasa, and others aren't working together. They're not on the same page. And finally, there is a third factor involved in making Shebas. And to some degree, the church and its leaders have some responsibility for this, but mostly this one is on all of us. We're all on the hook for this one. Sheba incites rebellion around one of the oldest fears in the book. In verse 1, Sheba blows his trumpet and he cries out, "We have no portion in David. We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse." In 2 Samuel 8, verse 15, we were told that David reigned over all Israel. And David administered justice and equity to all his people. David was by no means a sinless person. We've discovered this in the last few weeks as we've looked at David and his big sins. But 1 and 2 Samuel tell one consistent story. David was a good and fair king. He showed his enemies far more grace than they deserved. He went out of his way to make sure that other tribes knew that he was going to take care of them and that they had a place in his kingdom. And so Sheba is standing up and he is crying to the people that they should be afraid that David is somehow something other than what he is. Sheba arouses fear and anger in the people by deceiving them and by bearing false witness against David. Sheba arouses fear and anger in the people by appealing to their self-interest and by convincing them that they're not being taken care of. Will David take care of you? He asks them. Will you get what God promised you? Will David look out for your interests? Of course, Sheba answers this question for them with a resounding no. David will take from you your portion, the portion that God has given you. David will steal your inheritance from you. Don't trust him. Look out for yourselves. Go back to your tents. Join me, and I will make sure your interests are taken care of. If this kind of appeal to self-interest and fear doesn't sound familiar, you haven't been paying attention to the election. This is the language that is echoing through this election. But more than that, this attitude, are you meeting my needs? Is at the heart of most conflicts I've ever seen in the church. Each of us looking out for our own interests and not the interests of each other, as Paul calls us to in Philippians 2. So this is why I said that this third factor is on all of us. Shebas can only gain influence in the church if we are busy grumbling about what the church isn't doing for us. We can only be incited to rebel when we've been nurturing resentment and bitterness toward the church, toward the people in the church. You know, the early church had a really simple way of dealing with this sort of thing. One of the very first conflicts the church ever experienced, at least as we read it in Acts, was over a real question about whether a group of widows was being fed fairly. In a church that did not have a precedent for splitting or dividing, and in a church where leaders were devoted to working together as one, the solution was quickly and easily developed. There's a group of widows not being cared for, so we'll identify some faithful servants who have a special connection to the widows, and they will be responsible for making sure the widows get what they need. I mean, it's seriously so simple that it's almost like embarrassing that you have to sort of say that, right? Explain what's going on there. We're concerned that this need isn't being met. Oh, we should do something about that. But the norm in the church in America is for someone to say, the church isn't meeting my needs, I'm going to leave. Or the church isn't looking out for me and for what I like, so I'm going to go start my own church. Or, the possibilities are endless. Because we're incredibly creative in the ways that we will divide Christ's church. If only we were so creative in our peacemaking and in our efforts to live as one people. This is where our creativity can be put to good use. Because of the self-centered, self-obsessed culture we live in, because we have been trained to be intensely individualistic, looking out for ourselves and our own interests, we are being equipped daily with lots of reasons why we should be afraid, why we should be discontent in our church. Add to that the fact that we're part of a tradition, the Protestant tradition, that has division and separation in its DNA. And you will see that we are incredibly susceptible to considering division or separation and then actually seeing it as a legitimate option should a Sheba rise among us. But I do have good news for you. We are part of a local congregation that is served by a group of faithful overseers, David and Tom and Jay and Laura and Alex, who pray hard and who work hard for unity. At almost every meeting this year, we've talked about the importance of being united and serving as one. We pray for each other. We share the ways that we're growing together. We talk about how we can be better at submitting our lives to each other. We want to model a path of peacemaking, a path of unity for the church as a whole. As Sheba reminds us, this is the sort of ongoing, diligent, hard work and prayer that's not flashy, but that we have to be engaged in long before Shebas ever rise. But guess what? I have even better news for you. Because here's the deal. If the good news this morning, if the good news that we've gathered to hear is that a bunch of flawed people are trying their best to be unified, I'd say we're in trouble. Amen. But the good news this morning is that we serve a God who is capable of tearing down every wall of hostility that we create. We serve a God this morning who is capable of transforming our hearts. A God who is capable of turning us into servants. A God who is capable of making us into the kind of people who can be one with each other. I saw this on Twitter this week, and it perfectly sums up the real good news. This morning, we thank God for the church. This people who can say, I'm with her, or Trump's with me, who gather at this table to hear Jesus say, you are mine. This morning we remember together that our salvation is a gift from God. And so is the church. The way we treat the church is just as important as the way we treat our salvation. And so we come to the table this morning as people who have nothing apart from what God gives us, who come to the table as children with open hands, ready to receive God's incredible provision, His generous grace, His lavish mercy, to receive bread and cup and be reminded that we have been given salvation, to join around a table made up of this motley crew of people, and to say, we have been given this gift. It is good, and let us be glad and rejoice in it.